You could smell the roasted boar from the other side of the courtyard. Its skin crackled in the fire, juices hissing onto the glowing embers as servants basted it again and again, the fat glistening like a king's crown. You carried the silver platters, polished so perfectly that you could see your own sweat-soaked reflection, a face hollow from hunger, glancing longingly at food you'd never taste. That was the rule. You served the meat, but you didn't eat it. You poured the wine, but you drank water from a wooden bowl, sometimes with hay floating in it. And when the hall echoed with laughter and music and the clinking of goblets, you stood still in the shadows, invisible. There was no envy, not really, because envy implies a sense of possibility. For you, there was none. That boar was not your meal. It was part of the spectacle, the ritual, the theater of power. The nobility didn't just eat, they performed consumption. They tore meat from bone with their fingers, wiped grease on ermine sleeves, and flung bones onto the floor like gods bored of their own creation. You, meanwhile, crouched to pick them up before the dogs did. And if you were lucky, you might gnaw a discarded piece of gristle in the kitchen hours later when no one was looking. If this story moved something inside you, even just a little, don't forget to subscribe. There are more voices like this one, waiting to be heard. And tell me, from where in the world are you watching? I want to know how far these echoes travel. The cook was a tyrant in his own right, ruling over the chaos of smoke, blood, and open flame. His screams often pierced louder than the bells of the chapel, and his ladle wasn't just for soup. Burnt bread? You got a welt, late with the pig, another welt, and yet, in that steaming, stinking hell beneath the castle's great hall, the cook held more power than you ever would. He tasted the sauces. He licked his fingers. He chose who got the scraps. You bowed to him just as you bowed to the knights. Rank had no armor. It wore aprons, too. Sometimes, during festivals, the feasting lasted for days. Whole oxen turned on spits. Fish swam in molded jellies. Swans were stuffed with herbs and dyed with saffron until their feathers glowed like fire. You helped bring it all to the tables, one heavy dish after another, your arms trembling with the weight. The nobles toasted the saints in the seasons, their mouths full of meat and wine, speaking of honor and conquest while your stomach growled so loud you feared it might betray you. In winter, it was worse. The cold gnawed through your bones as you stood barefoot on the kitchen stones, watching roasted apples steam in sugar and cinnamon. The scent alone was enough to make your head swim. One day, a young maid reached for a slice of pie cooling on the window ledge. She was caught. The steward whipped her, then made her stand in the courtyard for hours, barefoot in the snow, holding the pie aloft in trembling arms as a lesson to the others. That night, she couldn't stop crying. The pie, uneaten, was given to the dogs. Sometimes the line between food and punishment blurred entirely. If a noble was in a foul mood, they might throw their meal across the hall. Not at the cook, never at a fellow aristocrat, but at you. Hot gravy on your cheek, a boiled onion rolling down your sleeve. You apologized, you cleaned, and if you were truly fortunate, that was the end of it. Because sometimes it wasn't. There were rules, of course. Unspoken ones, carved deep into your back like a scar. Never eat before the Lord, never sit while the guests are seated, never speak unless spoken to, and even then, only to answer, "Yes, my lord," or "At once, my lady." You were part of the castle's decor. Not a man or woman, just another object meant to shine and serve and stay silent. But your body told a different story. It ached, it cracked, it cried for rest. And still, you returned each day to the same hall, the same smells, the same spectacle. Watching them eat became your own form of starvation, not just of the body, but of identity. You were a ghost who carried fire and metal and meat, haunting the castle in daylight. And no one ever wondered if the ghost was hungry. You might think, at least there was warmth in the great hall, but the heat of the fires never reached your corner. You stood behind columns or beneath the balcony where the wind slipped through stone gaps like a knife through cloth. Your feet froze, but you dared not shift them. Once a boy moved too much and spilled a flagon. He vanished the next day. Rumor had it he'd been thrown in the moat. Others said he was scrubbing latrines in the lower vaults. No one asked, no one dared. Even the food you prepared for yourself, barley mash, old onions, crusts soaked in ale, had to be rationed. The kitchen boys stole. The older servants hoarded. There was no charity, only hunger competing with fear. And somehow, through all of this, you learned to live without tasting sweetness. Because if you let yourself remember how honey felt on your tongue, the bitterness of your life might break you. Yet still, you served. Through burns and bruises and aching backs, you served when they yelled, when they cheered, when they danced on tables and puked in golden bowls. You served after hours, scrubbing the floor where a knight had pissed in a corner, too drunk to find the latrine. You served while the minstrels played songs about glory and virtue, knowing none of it belonged to you. And if the Lord was pleased, he might nod. Not at you, but in your direction. And for that, you were meant to feel pride, gratitude even, as though recognition could fill an empty stomach. But when the music ended and the last goblet clinked, the guests retired to feather beds layered with furs. And you returned to your place, not to rest, but to prepare for the next morning. You slept on straw that smelled of mold. You curled into yourself to preserve body heat. And if you were near the stables, you breathed in horse piss like it was incense. Because in a castle not built for you, survival wasn't noble. It was feral. It was silence, submission, and sacrifice. You learned to live beside abundance without touching it. You learned to carry weight that no one saw. You learned to disappear, but with dignity, if you could still remember what that meant. You've walked through the castle with me. You've felt the cold, the weight, the silence. If this journey spoke to you, hit that subscribe button. Your presence matters here. And drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? Let's build this map of silent survivors together. And above your head, chandeliers glowed with candles you'd lit. Plates shimmered with reflections of a world you'd never taste. And somewhere, in the echoes of the great hall, your stomach still growled. Not just for food, but for something no one there would ever offer. Not when you still had chambers to scrub and hooves to polish before sunrise. They told you the castle was a fortress, impenetrable, a symbol of strength, carved in stone and wrapped in walls thick enough to swallow sound. But they didn't tell you that those same walls trapped the cold, that they turned every breath into fog, every joint into ice, every morning into a fight against frostbite. Your bed, if it could be called that, was a pile of straw near the stables, pressed close to the wooden slats for any trace of warmth. But the only heat came from the beasts, their breath steaming, their flanks radiating life. And their urine, steaming, pungent, was sometimes the only thing between you and frozen feet. The stone of the castle didn't just resist fire, it mocked it. No matter how many hearths blazed in the halls above, their heat never reached the lower chambers. Down there, where you and others like you toiled and slept, it was always damp. Moisture seeped from the walls, dripped from the ceiling, pooled in the corners where rats bred and skittered. Your clothes, often worn wet from chores, never fully dried. You learned to ignore the chill that clung to your skin like a second, crueler layer. In the noble chambers, tapestries muffled the wind, fur-lined cloaks were layered over silk, and firewood burned without pause. But the great halls were deceptive. The heat stopped at the center. Step too far from the fire, and your breath misted again. Those seated near the hearth laughed and toasted while servants like you lined the walls, shivering, hiding chattering teeth behind clenched jaws. Lice and fleas were constant companions. They nested in the rushes, spread over stone floors, in the folds of your wool tunic, in the seams of your undergarments. Everyone had them, even the nobles, though they'd never admit it. They bathed in rosewater and wore lavender satchels, but you knew better. You saw the scratching behind closed doors. You cleaned the linens. You burned the infested clothes. For you, there was no hiding the infestation. You lived in it, slept with it, itched through it. Your skin bore the red signatures of their feast, and the only relief came with vinegar or fire, and even those were rare. There was no such thing as privacy. You changed in front of others, relieved yourself in public pits, and tried not to make a sound when diarrhea from spoiled barley soup racked your body at night. Even the castle's guardrobes, the supposed toilets, were holes in stone walls that dropped waste into open air, or worse, into cesspits that festered beneath the castle foundations. In summer, the stench crawled up through the stone like a living thing. In winter, the cold made the air dry but no less foul. You cleaned them with a bucket and a stick, and if something fell down, a ring, a coin, a silver hairpin, guess who was sent in after it? And yet, illness was not an excuse. If your skin burned with fever, if your knees trembled from weakness, it didn't matter. The lord needed his cloak brushed, the lady wanted her hair braided, the chamber pots didn't empty themselves. So you worked, hollow and wheezing, hoping the sickness wouldn't kill you, but almost wishing it would. The castle, for all its majesty, was alive with rot. Wood rotted, stone cracked, mold bloomed in hidden corners. Insects hatched in the pantries, maggots in the meats. Sometimes you swatted them away as you prepared the meals. Sometimes they became part of the dish. You didn't say a word. You couldn't, because the cook would strike you and the noble wouldn't care. If anything, they'd blame you for the infestation, even if the entire castle was crawling with it. The walls whispered at night. Wind howled through gaps in the masonry, and footsteps echoed when no one was there. Superstition filled the silence. You'd hear stories about ghosts, servants who died in the oubliettes, children crushed by collapsing ceilings, maids who threw themselves from towers. Sometimes you believed it, because fear was easier than hope. At least fear kept you alert. Hope just made you reckless. But the most disturbing sounds didn't come from ghosts. They came from behind locked doors. The cries of a punished squire, the sobbing of a kitchen girl, the low voice of a noble commanding obedience from someone who dared say no. And you? You kept your eyes on the ground. You stirred the pot. You swept the floor. You became part of the silence, because speaking meant danger. Not for the abuser, but for you. Even during celebration, your world remained dim. When music filled the halls and guests danced in silks, you moved like a shadow along the edges, carrying jugs, refilling cups. catching drunken knights before they toppled. You didn't dance. You didn't laugh. You didn't belong. And if you caught yourself smiling at the melody, you stopped. Because joy was a risk. It reminded you of everything you'd never have. Clothing was another deception. The nobles wore furs, gold-threaded gowns, doublets that shimmered in the light. You wore the same tunic day after day. When it tore, you patched it. When it stained, you scrubbed until your fingers bled. But nothing ever looked clean. The soot of the castle lived in the fabric, the grease from the kitchen, the blood from the butcher's block, the sweat from endless labor. They fused into your clothes, and no wash could remove them. Sometimes you were sent to clean noble chambers. The scent of lavender and beeswax hung heavy in the air, and the sheets were soft as clouds. But the filth hid beneath the surface. A chamber pot unemptied for days, stains on the mattress from secrets no one dared speak. You scrubbed it all away, your fingers raw, your nose burning, and then you bowed and left, unacknowledged, unthanked, unseen. Yet even among servants there were castes. The chambermaids looked down on the stable boys, the kitchen scullions mocked the laundry girls. Everyone was desperate to feel above someone else. Because when you're crushed under a system, the only relief comes from finding someone lower than you. It was cruel. It was pathetic. It was survival. You never imagined escape. There was nowhere to go. The outside world was no kinder. Bandits roamed the forests. Lords owned the roads. Hunger followed you everywhere. And if you did run, and they caught you, the punishment was worse than death. Branding, mutilation, a collar that marked you forever. No, better to endure? Better to dream of nothing. Better to forget that you were ever meant to be more than what you'd become. And still the sun rose. Still the bells rang. Still your hands reached for the broom, the bucket, the torch. Because a castle may look like a monument to power, but its bones are made of people like you. Forgotten, broken, and necessary. Tomorrow you do it all again. Perhaps with new lice, perhaps with a new scar, but always with the same silence in your chest. Because in this place, you learned something they never intended to teach you. Survival is not about glory. It's about not being the one left behind when the frost creeps in and the fire dies. And above your head, the laughter of the great hall would echo again. You would hear forks scraping plates and boots stomping rhythms on the stone. But you'd be below it all, listening to life pass by through cracks in the floor. You weren't just a servant. You were a tool, multi-purpose, replaceable, and expected to function without complaint. In the castle, roles blurred, collapsed into each other. One day you were cleaning chamber pots. The next you were brushing a horse's flanks or hauling water up 4 flights of stone stairs for the ladies' bath. If the guard fell ill, you stood in his place. If the laundress died of fever, you boiled linen until your skin blistered. And if a noble needed someone to carry a bloodied tunic to the fire, no questions asked, you didn't even blink. There were no job descriptions, no negotiations. You belonged to the castle as much as its walls did. You were at once the guard, the messenger, the janitor, the groom, the squire's errand boy, and the cook's second pair of hands. And still, none of it granted you identity. You were not the tailor, not the cook, not even the chambermaid. You were boy or girl, or sometimes just a whistle and a snap of fingers. The castle never bothered to learn your name. Names, after all, were for those who mattered. Some called it training. They said learning to do everything made you valuable. But value is a strange thing when it never translates to safety, or food, or rest. You didn't rise in the ranks. You just got better at suffering silently. You developed instincts, when to disappear, when to speak, how to balance a heavy tray without letting your aching wrist tremble. You learned to stay awake for 30 hours straight, to patch your own wounds with kitchen twine, to smile when the noble lady called you filthy, because your face was smudged with soot from the fireplace you kept burning. And when there was a fire, or an invasion, or a sudden scream in the middle of the night, you didn't get to panic. You fetched the knight's armor, oiled the hinges, tightened the straps. You helped him into it like you were dressing your own executioner. Then you grabbed a broom, a torch, a knife from the kitchen, and joined the line. Not at the front, never there, but somewhere in the back. Eyes scanning the dark, heart pounding in your chest like it might break your ribs. You weren't trained to fight, but you'd be expected to bleed if it came to that. Once, a rat infestation reached the grain stores. You spent 3 days on your knees, setting traps, crushing skulls with stones, scooping droppings with bare hands. You weren't a pest killer, but it didn't matter. It needed doing. Another time, a nobleman's prized hunting hound fell ill, and you were summoned to care for it. Not because you were a healer, you weren't even allowed near the herb stores, but because someone had to stay awake with the animal all night and wipe its drool. You were more dispensable than the dog, but perhaps the cruelest part wasn't the labor, it was the illusion of closeness. You carried armor for knights, held their swords, ran beside them into battle drills. You braided the lady's hair, fetched her rose water, listened to her whisper secrets about the man she loved. And in those moments, fleeting and fragile, you almost felt human. Almost. Until they reminded you. A slap for speaking out of turn. A kick when you flinched too slowly. A broken dish blamed on your clumsy hands, even when the Lord himself had dropped it mid-argument. The castle demanded not just your hands, but your loyalty. A loyalty without recognition, without promise. You were expected to protect what didn't protect you. Die for people who couldn't pronounce your name. Keep secrets that could cost you your tongue if spoken. Once, a squire stumbled drunkenly into the stables and mistook a milkmaid for a plaything. She screamed. You ran to help. The next morning, she was gone, and you were summoned to the master-at-arms for punishment. You should have minded your place, he said, before striking you across the face. And still, you stayed, because the outside world offered no guarantee. Here, at least, there was bread, sometimes stale, sometimes moldy, but bread nonetheless. Here, your hands bled for someone else's wealth, but they bled in a rhythm you understood. Pain became routine. Exhaustion became muscle memory. You learned to sleep sitting up, to breathe through your mouth when the latrine overflowed, to bite your tongue so hard it bled when a noble called you beast for stumbling after 30 hours without rest. Some nights, as you brushed the hall floors with a bundle of twigs, you'd overhear the nobles talk of war, of love, of things so distant from your world they may as well have been stories. A knight boasting about the tournament at Caen, a lady giggling over a letter from a suitor. They didn't notice you, or if they did, they assumed you didn't understand, but you heard everything. You collected their words like a thief, storing them for the moments when your body screamed and your spirit faltered. It was your secret revenge, knowing more than they assumed you could. There were moments of quiet, sometimes. Right before dawn, when the castle still slept and the coals were low, you'd sit in the corridor outside the kitchen and listen to the wind press against the stone. In those moments, you imagined another life, one where you didn't flinch at footsteps, where your body wasn't someone else's tool, where your worth wasn't measured by how many tasks you could endure without breaking. But the moment never lasted. The cook's bell would ring, and the world would return to its sharp-edged reality. Even prayer was a labor. You knelt in the cold chapel, not to find peace, but to keep appearances. The nobility prayed to thank God for their victories. You prayed not to fall dead in the scullery. You prayed that the frost wouldn't steal your toes, that the master wouldn't notice you today, that the wine barrel wouldn't run dry and spark another beating. You learned to speak to heaven in whispers, to ask for things that required no miracles, just a day without bruises, just a full bowl of stew, and if a festival came, with torches and ribbons and minstrels playing lutes, you danced, not for joy, but for their entertainment. You wore bells on your ankles and a painted mask, and spun in circles until you collapsed, dizzy and sweating, and they clapped as if you were a puppet. Then you were dragged away to clean the vomit from the banquet steps. That too was part of the show. Still, you found ways to remain alive in spirit. You etched tiny marks into the stone behind the kitchens to count the years. You hummed songs your grandmother taught you long before the castle swallowed your voice. You carved a tiny spoon from a broken plank and hid it beneath the floorboards. Not because you needed it, but because it was yours and no one else's. And that, perhaps, was the only true rebellion. Because in a place where you were told you were nothing, where your hands served, your mouth stayed shut, your name was forgotten, any act of selfhood became sacred. You didn't fight back. You couldn't. But you remembered who you were, even when they didn't. And that memory, fragile as it was, kept you moving. Even as the bells rang again, even as you rose to sweep the ash from the hearth and tie your ragged tunic tighter around your ribs, because no matter how many roles they forced upon you, no matter how many times you were turned into a tool, you still carried something they could never see, a piece of yourself, hidden, burning, waiting. The castle was a monument to power. Stone towers piercing the sky, walls as thick as the lies they were built on, banners fluttering like the pride of men who'd never cleaned their own blood from a blade. From the outside, it looked like glory. But from within, if you were the one scrubbing chamber pots, mending boots, or carrying corpses after a failed hunt, it felt more like a prison carved out of damp rock. The walls didn't protect you. They contained you. Every room, every hallway, every stairwell held a different version of your suffering. The kitchens scalded, the cellars froze. The latrines gagged you with stench. The laundry boiled your skin raw. But the worst wasn't the pain. It was the infestation, not just of lice and fleas, though there were plenty, but of rot. The slow, silent kind that crept into your bones and told you, this is your life and it will never change. Your bed was never yours. Your space never private. You shared it with a rotating cast of the desperate, stable hands, kitchen girls, a rat catcher once who coughed blood for 2 weeks before disappearing behind the herbalist's hut. You never saw him again. No one asked questions. Illness was shame, weakness was failure, and failure was disposal. Not a single sermon in the castle chapel ever preached that mercy applied to the poor. Even when you weren't sick, you still looked it. Pale from lack of sun, calloused from labor, rashes from damp clothes that never dried. Flea bites patterned your skin like a map of bruises. And yet the nobles called you unclean, as though you chose the filth, as though you had time to wash your only tunic when you worked 18 hours a day without pause, as though the cold bathwater in the outer courtyard was enough to scrub away months of grime and humiliation. Some castles had bathhouses, most didn't. The ones that did often closed them to servants. You washed where the horses did, or not at all. Sometimes, in desperation, you snuck into the laundry basin after hours, just to feel warmth again. One girl tried that in winter. The water turned her lips blue. She died the next morning. The laundress was blamed, then whipped, then replaced. Not because anyone cared about the girl, but because discipline made the machine run smoother. You tried not to look up. The ceilings leaked. Not always visibly. Sometimes they just wept moisture slowly, soaking into hay, into fabric, into skin. Mold grew in corners like a second language, ancient and alive. You breathed it in until your lungs stopped protesting, and when you did look up, perhaps just to stretch your aching neck, you saw cobwebs heavy with dust, or bats, or rats the size of dogs, scurrying across beams like they owned the place. And maybe, in a way, they did, because the castle fed them, leftovers dumped in moats, blood from butchered animals dripping into open drains, forgotten sacks of barley crawling with larvae. You weren't allowed to waste food, but food wasted itself around you. The paradox gnawed at your stomach louder than hunger. You once saw a mouse chew through a wheel of cheese while you were beaten for sneaking a spoonful of stew. The mouse lived. You limped for a week. Even the air was heavy. In summer it thickened, with the sweat of bodies crammed together, mixing with the scent of manure, of roasted meat, of unwashed feet, and decaying straw. In winter it thinned, so cold it sliced your nostrils, so sharp it silenced conversation. But whether it choked or cut, it never brought relief. The only fresh air came from the arrow slits in the stone, and those let in more wind than breath. You dreamed of forests, of open sky, but all you saw were stone and smoke and suffering. And yet the nobles held feasts. Their halls overflowed with candles and laughter, even as you scraped black mold from their walls in secret. They danced while your fingers bled from scrubbing soot. They spilled wine on tapestries you couldn't afford to touch. Once, a knight dropped an entire roast duck onto the floor. He demanded it be replaced, then made you eat the one that fell, laughing as grease rolled down your chin. You chewed in silence, ashamed to feel grateful. Even when there were no guests, the castle demanded performance. The hearths had to blaze to show wealth. The walls had to shine. The floors had to reflect torchlight. You polished stone with rags until your knuckles split. You climbed ladders to dust shelves you couldn't reach. You boiled lime to whiten fireplaces, blackened from nobles' cigars and arrogance. And when you finished, you began again. Because the castle didn't sleep. It only paused. And you were its heartbeat. Constant, unnoticed, essential. Sometimes you saw the inside of rooms you weren't supposed to. The lord's study, the lady's boudoir, hidden passages where secret meetings left wine-stained carpets and broken chalices. You saw things, you heard things, and you carried them like wounds, a child locked in a cupboard for speaking back, a noblewoman whispering threats to a trembling maid, blood on sheets that no one explained. You knew better than to speak. Truth didn't belong to your kind. Only silence did. But silence had weight. It pressed on your spine as you stood in the corner of the great hall, holding a tray for hours. It coiled around your throat when a noble accused you of theft you didn't commit. It strangled your sleep when screams echoed from the tower. You bore it because you had no choice. Because the moment you did speak, even a whisper, your life could end before the next sunrise. There were stories of servants who broke, who screamed, who ran. One boy leapt from the wall, hoping to flee through the forest. They caught him, cut off his toes, made him sweep the courtyard with his stumps. Another girl cursed a visiting bishop after he groped her. Her tongue was removed. You cleaned the knife afterward, washed it, dried it, put it back in the kitchen drawer. Still, the castle endured. It devoured the weak, rewarded the cruel, protected the corrupt, and yet somehow it needed you. It couldn't function without you. And that truth, buried deep beneath centuries of stone and silence, was what kept you breathing. Because the stones didn't scrub themselves, the fires didn't light themselves, the nobles didn't feed themselves. You were the hidden machinery behind their grandeur. And if the castle ever crumbled, if the banners fell, if the lords fled, it would be people like you who survived. Not because you were strong, but because you already knew how to live in the cracks. Because you understood pain without spectacle, work without praise, suffering without song. Because you were the shadow that held the fortress together. And shadows, unlike kings, don't disappear when the light dies. They told you the nobility were chosen by God, that their blood was different, that their faces, pale, clean, perfumed, were carved by divine will to be admired, obeyed, and served. And for most of your life, you believed it. Not because it made sense, but because it made survival easier. You were born to serve, and they were born to be served. That was the way of the world. That was the truth etched into the castle walls as deeply as any inscription. But when you spent enough years staring up at them from the floor, from the dirt, the kitchen ash, the stone steps you scrubbed with bare hands, something inside you started to crack. You began to see them clearly, not as gods wrapped in silk, but as people, flawed, cowardly, petty, sometimes monstrous. They cried when their fathers died. They screamed in fear when thunder shook the towers. They bled like pigs in the hunt. And once you saw that, you couldn't unsee it. The nobility glittered from above, but only if you squinted through the smoke and ignored the rot. They dressed in velvet, yes, but the velvet stank of mildew when they left it too long in the trunks. They wore crowns of gold, but some had teeth rotting in their mouths from too much sugared wine. You knew. You saw them in the mornings, retching into basins, eyes bloodshot, breath sour from sleepless nights and secret poisons. And you held the bowl steady. You wiped their mouths. You cleaned the floor when they stumbled and spat. What they called elegance was often just cruelty in disguise. A lady might host a poetry reading and then force the blind minstrel to sleep in the stable afterward. A baron might toast honor and duty, while his bastard son starved in a forgotten room below the gatehouse. Their words were polished, their souls were not. And behind every performance of grace, there were hands like yours, bleeding behind curtains, tying corsets too tight, stitching lace until your fingers split. You once watched a nobleman beat a servant for scuffing his boots. You were made to clean the blood afterward, not just from the floor, but from the leather. Then he asked you why the shine had dulled, and you apologized. He slapped you, and then he demanded wine, and you poured it, hand steady, face blank, rage buried so deep it no longer had a voice. And that's what made it worse. The proximity, the unbearable closeness. You knew their secrets, their fears, their ugliness, and yet you were expected to admire them, to speak of them with reverence, to smile when they passed and pretend they didn't reek of cowardice or cruelty or cold sweat from nightmares they'd never admit to. Some would offer kindness, a smile, a coin, a word of praise, but kindness from above was dangerous. It bred hope, and hope was not something you could afford. It made you hesitate, made you wonder if one day things might change, if the Lord's son, who once gave you a ribbon, might speak up for you when the steward grew violent. He didn't. He never would. And the ribbon eventually became part of your mop. You learned slowly that there was a difference between respect and obedience. The castle didn't demand respect. It demanded fear. It dressed it up in protocol and titles and ceremony, but underneath it was always the same. Kneel or be crushed. Bow or be beaten. Obey or vanish. And so you performed, every day, every hour, the ritual of deference. Your eyes down, your back bent, your voice low, not because they earned it, but because they required it. And yet, there were moments when the mask slipped. A noble woman who sobbed in the garden because her husband didn't love her. A young knight shaking before his first battle, whispering to himself like a boy. A baron caught drunk and crying over a letter he burned the next morning. You saw them. You didn't speak. But in those moments, you felt something dangerous creeping in. Not pity, not connection. Power. Because you knew them better than they knew you. And that meant something, even if you could never say it aloud. But knowing wasn't enough. It didn't feed you. It didn't save you. You still knelt when the Lord entered the hall. You still waited behind the curtain when the family feasted, holding the next course with numb fingers while your own belly ached. You still washed their linens, their sins, their bodies if asked. You still bowed. Because rebellion didn't live in words. It lived in small acts, a glance too long, a task done with just enough care to pass, but not enough to shine, a memory hoarded, a truth never spoken. Sometimes you wondered what made them noble. Was it the land, the titles, the blood? No one could ever answer. The steward said it was divine right. The priest said God's will. But you saw their children grow up cruel, indifferent, pampered into uselessness. You saw their daughters marry men who hit them. You saw the weight of the crown break the backs of boys too soft for war. And still the lie endured, because the system needed it to. But the most painful part wasn't what they did to you. It was what they made you do to others. You turned on your own, blamed a stable hand for something you dropped, took the best food for yourself before sharing the scraps, whispered lies to stay in favor. And because the castle was a beast, and to live inside it, you had to become part of its hunger. And you hated yourself for it, every time. But you did it again, because surviving meant becoming what you once feared. And yet, no matter how hard you tried, they never saw you as anything more than a shadow, a function, a thing. The knight you once nursed through fever passed you in the corridor a year later and didn't even blink. The lady whose child you delivered told others it was her midwife. You vanished from their memory as quickly as you entered it. You learned to make peace with that. Not forgiveness, never that, but understanding. You stopped expecting thanks. You stopped expecting fairness. You became a ghost with flesh, a soul folded into silence. And still you served. Because the castle never gave you permission to be anything else. But deep inside, something stirred. A knowledge, maybe. A whisper that said, the higher the throne, the further the fall. And stones remember footsteps. And shadows, though silent, are always watching. And in a place built on obedience, there is nothing more dangerous than someone who sees everything and still endures. Because one day, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not for years, something cracks. And when it does, it won't be loud. It'll be quiet, patient, final, just like you. There were no weekends in the castle, no days off, no celebrations that were truly yours. Time was not a river, but a chain, links of duty clinking one after the other, unbroken, unrelenting. You didn't live your life. You performed it day after day, in service to names that were carved in stone above doors you were not allowed to open. And if you stopped, even for a moment, if you forgot your place, the castle would remind you belonged to a family once, before the castle claimed you. Maybe your mother handed you over to the steward in exchange for bread and safety. Maybe your father died in a war he didn't understand. Or maybe no one gave you up. Maybe the castle just swallowed you the way it did with orphans and runaways and the poor. Either way, by the time you could carry a bucket or scrub a floor, you were property. Not by law, but by expectation. And in the castle, expectation was stronger than any writ. You began young, 7, maybe 8 years old, a page boy, a scullery girl. You weren't taught, you were commanded. Do it like this, the older servant hissed. Do it faster. You cried once when your fingers were burned on the hearthstone. The cook slapped you for being loud. Tears are for nobles, he said. You don't get that luxury. From that moment on, you learned to bleed in silence. You carried trays too heavy for your size, climbed stairs that seemed taller than towers, endured the endless barking of voices that only ever wanted one thing from you. More speed, more obedience, more silence. Never thanks, never rest, just more. You watched the young lords grow beside you. Same age, same size, but their world was stitched in gold. They learned falconry while you mucked out their birds' cages. They practiced swordplay while you polished their steel and brought water for their bruises. They were praised for every clumsy triumph. You were punished for every invisible mistake. You knew their faces better than your own. You knew what frightened them, what pleased them, and yet they never bothered to learn your name. Your childhood ended before it began. You didn't climb trees, you climbed ladders, carrying buckets of lime to whiten the walls. You didn't play games. You were the game, mocked and humiliated by bored squires who found amusement in your flinching. You didn't dream. You counted tasks like steps toward exhaustion, and then you grew older, but not freer. The more capable you became, the more you were expected to endure. By 15, your back ached like you were 50. You no longer questioned why the bread was stale or why your room flooded when it rained. You stopped noticing the lice. You stopped caring when your fingernails turned black from cold and grime. You adapted, not because you were strong, but because you had no choice. If you were lucky, you had a mentor, an older servant who taught you where to hide when the steward was drunk, who showed you which parts of the cellar stayed warm in winter, who gave you the last bit of stew on nights when the pot came up short. But even they disappeared eventually, sent to another castle, died in the stables, fell from a ladder, no funeral, no mourning, just another task reassigned. By the time you reached 30, your body bore the history of your silence. Knees ruined from stone floors, teeth missing from years of bad food and worse medicine, hands warped from cold and labor. And yet, in the eyes of the nobility, you were now old, not wise, not respected, just worn, diminished, disposable. You saw younger servants arrive, children with the same wide eyes you once had, and you taught them, just like someone once taught you, not with kindness, but with urgency. Do it like this. Don't speak. Don't look them in the eye. Not because you were cruel, but because cruelty was armor. You were preparing them for a life where softness meant suffering. Sometimes, in the stillness of early morning, you remembered who you might have been. A farmer, a craftsman, a parent, a person. But the castle didn't allow for alternate endings, only chapters of the same story, told in different voices, always beneath someone else's table. And then came the moment you feared the most. Not death, but uselessness. When your hands trembled too much to carry platters, when your knees gave out during prayer, when your breath wheezed so loud in the corridor that the nobles complained, you were no longer invisible. You were in the way. Some were dismissed, given a coin and a nod. Others were assigned to the most degrading tasks, latrine scraping, rat catching, grave digging. To keep them busy, they said, as if a life spent in service needed justification to continue. And some simply disappeared. You heard whispers. He fell from the wall. She wandered into the woods. But you knew the truth. They were removed, quietly, because the castle preferred its ghosts to be silent. And yet, somehow you endured. Not because you were brave, but because endurance was your inheritance, passed from one forgotten soul to the next. You carried it like a torch no one saw, lighting corridors no noble ever walked. And in that darkness, among the discarded and the damned, you found a strange kind of power. You knew the castle better than any lord. You knew which stones were loose, which steps creaked, which walls whispered secrets when the wind was right. You saw the cracks beneath the gold, the rot beneath the marble. You understood the truth behind the illusion, and so, in the final years, when your body no longer obeyed, when your breath came in shallow waves, when your back refused to straighten, you didn't look to the tower for salvation. You looked within, to the stubborn ember that refused to die. The memory of every task survived, every insult swallowed, every indignity endured without breaking. Because while the nobles feared losing their titles, their lands, their power, you feared nothing. You had already lived the worst, and still you were here, scarred, bent, breathing, and somewhere in the castle a new child arrived. Small hands, bare feet, eyes wide with terror and awe, and you watched, and you knew. The chain would continue, but so would the memory, the quiet strength, the invisible defiance, passed on not in words, but in glances, in gestures, in survival. And the castle, for all its grandeur, would never understand. Its greatest threat didn't come from armies or sieges or rival kings. It came from those who endured it all and remembered everything. It was said that loyalty was a virtue, that to serve without question, to obey without hesitation, was the mark of a good soul. They praised it in sermons, carved it into the wood of chapel benches, embroidered it into the banners that fluttered above the castle's tallest tower. But no one ever asked what loyalty cost. Not the kind you gave, the kind that was expected of you, the kind that was demanded even when it came with bruises instead of thanks. Loyalty, for you, didn't mean devotion. It meant silence. It meant endurance. It meant kneeling when your knees were raw and standing when your legs threatened to collapse. You weren't loyal because you admired them. You were loyal because survival required it. Because the only thing worse than being at the bottom was being cast out of it. You swore oaths, not once, but again and again. Not with ceremony, but with actions. Each task done without question, each order followed without pause. You promised your body, your time, your breath, to a name that could be stripped from your memory as quickly as your dignity was from your skin. And when they changed masters, when the old lord died and his son took over, your loyalty had to shift seamlessly, like your heart could be traded as easily as your apron. No one ever asked if you were tired, or if you believed in the cause. The lord rode to war, and you stood in the yard holding the reins of his horse. He marched under a banner that had nothing to do with you, to fight a war that would never touch his own table, while you stayed behind. Not because you were spared, but because someone had to guard the castle gates, mend the armor, feed the hounds, keep the fire burning. And sometimes, when the war came too close, you did fight, with broom handles, with farm tools, with whatever you could grab when the alarm bells rang and the walls shook with fear. You weren't trained, you weren't paid, you weren't even counted in the stories afterward, but your blood spilled on the same ground. Your screams rose with the smoke, and when the danger passed, the nobles toasted their bravery while your wounded were buried in unmarked graves behind the stables. Still, you stayed. Because leaving wasn't freedom. It was exile. It was hunger and cold and the suspicion of every passing night. A servant without a master was a thief by default. A woman alone was fair game. A man alone was a threat. The world outside didn't care about your suffering. It only punished your absence. So you stayed. You served. You endured. And the more loyal you were, the more invisible you became. There were moments, brief and cruel, when loyalty felt like pride, when you carried a message through a storm and the steward nodded in approval, when you polished the Lord's armor so well he noticed, when the lady smiled, not at you, but in your direction, and you felt something bloom in your chest. But pride was a dangerous thing. It made you lift your head, it made you hope, and in the castle, hope was always punished. Once, a boy named Henri, no older than 12, stood too straight when the Baroness passed by. She called it arrogance. He said he meant no harm. That night, he was made to kneel in the chapel for hours while the cold seeped into his bones. He caught a fever. He never recovered. They called it a lesson. You called it murder. But you didn't say that. You couldn't. Loyalty also meant carrying secrets. You knew which nobleman stole from the treasury, which knight visited the wine cellar too often, which lady met her lover in the garden at midnight. You knew when the food was short and the ration lists were falsified. You knew that the master-at-arms used his belt more often than his sword, but you said nothing, because truth had no place in your mouth, only obedience. You were told to pray, to kneel before the altar and thank God for the chance to serve. You whispered the words, even when your heart was numb, even when you doubted whether God had ever stepped foot inside the stone chapel. You crossed yourself and begged forgiveness, not for your sins, but for your thoughts, for the hatred you swallowed, for the rage you buried, for the shame you wore like a second skin. Because loyalty in the castle was a form of erasure, you gave up your will, your voice, your name. You became what they needed, always shifting, always quiet, always there. And yet, somewhere deep inside, You still remembered who you were before the chains of duty wrapped around your soul. There were moments when that memory stirred, when you saw injustice and your fists clenched, when a child cried and you couldn't look away, when a fellow servant was struck and you stepped forward, not to fight, but to stand there. In solidarity, quiet, steady. That too was loyalty, not to the lords, but to each other, because there was another kind of loyalty, one they didn't teach, one they didn't recognize. Loyalty to the ones who cooked beside you, who cleaned with you, who bled with you, the girl who slipped you half a crust when you missed supper, the man who covered for your absence when your feet gave out, the old woman who whispered prayers when no priest came. They were your real family, and your loyalty to them, that was sacred. You learned to communicate in glances, in gestures, in silence. When someone was in danger, you warned them without words. When the punishment was coming, you created a distraction. When the burden became too much, you carried a little extra, not because you had strength, but because they didn't. And in that quiet rebellion, you found your dignity. Because in a world that demanded loyalty from you while offering none in return, you chose where to plant your flag, not on the banners of your oppressors, but in the hearts of those who suffered beside you. And when the castle shook, when famine came, or fire, or siege, it was not the lords who kept it standing. It was you, and people like you, running water through the corridors, bracing the gates, nursing the sick, burying the dead. The nobles fled. They always did. But you stayed. Not because of a name carved into stone, but because someone had to hold the line. Someone had to care for the forgotten. Someone had to remain when all the silk and armor and titles turned to ash. That someone was you. And they never saw it coming. Because loyalty, true loyalty, doesn't bow to power. It endures it. And eventually it outlives it. There was no gentle beginning. Childhood in the castle was not marked by toys or lullabies, but by cold floors, heavy chores, and the sound of someone else's voice dictating your every move. If you were born within its walls, or worse, brought in as a servant's child, your life began not with discovery, but with duty. You didn't ask questions. You learned fast. And if you didn't, the castle had a way of correcting you. No one celebrated your first step. No one marked your birthdays. But they noticed when you could carry a jug, when your fingers were strong enough to grip a broom, when your back no longer wobbled under the weight of the chamber pot. That's when your real work began. At 7, maybe earlier, you were expected to be useful. They called it helping. But it was servitude, raw and unfiltered. You rose before the sun, often to the sound of someone shouting. You learned to lace up your worn tunic in the dark, to fold your straw mat before anyone tripped over it, to run to the kitchens without tripping on your own bare feet. There were no toys in your world, just ropes to pull, buckets to carry, ashes to sweep. The castle was a school of pain, and your teachers were hunger, frost, and humiliation. There was always something to carry. Firewood, water, messages, vomit buckets after a noble's feast. Your body was currency, traded daily for the right to survive another night. And no matter how much you gave, it was never enough. A dropped cup could cost you dinner. A spilled pail meant a slap. And if you cried, that was weakness. Weakness was dangerous. You watched other children disappear. Some got sick. Others were sent away, traded between estates like livestock. You didn't ask what happened. You learned quickly that curiosity was a privilege for those with soft hands. You kept your head down. You copied the older ones. You mimicked their silence, their posture, the way they moved like shadows through the stone halls. If you were a girl, you were trained to clean, to mend, to listen without responding. The older maids taught you how to fold linen in exact thirds, how to scrub bloodstains without asking where they came from, how to remove a noblewoman's shoes without looking at her feet. And when they noticed your body beginning to change, the curves, the eyes too bold, the hair too long, they warned you, not with words, with stares, with silence, with fear. Because beauty, in the castle, was not a gift. It was a target. There were stories. Whispers passed between wash basins and cellar doors, of a girl who caught the Lord's eye, of a boy summoned to a lady's chamber and returned pale, silent, broken. These weren't legends, they were warnings, and you carried them with you like invisible armor. You learned to hide, to dull your expression, to never be alone in the wrong corridor. And still, it happened. You saw the bruises, the torn sleeves, the sudden disappearances, and you said nothing, because speaking meant punishment, not for them, but for you. The castle didn't care who was hurt, only who caused discomfort, and it was never the nobles. You reached adulthood without realizing it. There was no ceremony, no acknowledgement. One day you were a child scrubbing floors. The next, you were expected to carry furniture, to haul barrels, to stay awake through the night if the nobles' guests needed more wine. Your limbs ached, but your value had increased. You were stronger, more useful. And that meant they could ask more, take more, break more. You fell in love once. Another servant. You exchanged glances during chores, touched hands under the table when no one was looking. It was innocent, pure even, but love was a risk. When it was discovered, one of you was reassigned to the outer barn. A punishment so quiet it didn't need explanation. The distance was only 50 steps, but it may as well have been 100 miles. You never touched again. And still, you hoped, because even in the coldest corners of the castle, the human heart resisted. You found moments, tiny, fragile moments, where you remembered that you were alive. The scent of baked bread when the cook wasn't watching. A laugh that escaped from your throat before you could swallow it. The warmth of a sunbeam through a window you weren't supposed to look through. It didn't last, but it reminded you. Age came fast. Not in years, but in wear. By 30, you felt 50. Your joints cracked when you bent to tie your shoes. Your eyesight dimmed from years of squinting at embroidery or firelight. Your skin carried burns from spilled stew, oil from the candelabras, bruises from carrying more than you should have. You were still called girl or boy, as if your labor had kept you from aging, as if acknowledging your suffering made them complicit. But the worst came when you were no longer useful. The castle didn't tell you, it simply forgot you. You weren't dismissed, you were overlooked. Tasks passed to younger hands. Your presence became a nuisance. Your name, once barked 100 times a day, now vanished into the stone. No one asked if you were tired. No one asked if you hurt. They assumed you'd fade, and maybe you did. But you also watched, and in watching you became dangerous, because you remembered. You saw the cracks, not in the walls, but in the people. The lies they told, the rules they broke, the sins they hid. You saw the same patterns repeat. New servants arriving terrified and wide-eyed, just like you once were. You saw the cycles, and you knew how to survive it. You taught them, quietly. A gesture here, a whispered warning there. How to move unseen, how to protect each other, how to stay human in a place that tried to strip it from you. You became the thing they never expected, a keeper of memory, a quiet rebellion, a witness to centuries of pain and perseverance. And no matter how much the castle ignored you, it could never erase you, because even as your body broke, your story remained, etched not in stone, but in the hearts of those you helped survive. Faith in the castle was not a choice. It was a rule, a rhythm, a ritual. The bells tolled at dawn, at noon, at dusk, and you were expected to pause, whatever you were doing, and bow your head. Even if you were knee-deep in mud, hauling buckets of waste, or bleeding from a burn in the kitchen, you crossed yourself, because to forget, or worse, to resist, was not seen as doubt. It was seen as rebellion. And rebellion, even in a whisper, was dangerous. There was a chapel built into the stone of the eastern wing, cold, narrow, heavy with incense. The floor was never clean. No one ever asked you to polish that floor, because even the nobles walked it with hesitation. Its silence was different from the rest of the castle, deeper, as if the stones there remembered the confessions whispered into them, the blood spilled in their name, the fear disguised as piety. You didn't go there for comfort. You went because you had to. On holy days, you lined up with the others, heads bowed, backs straight, trying not to cough or scratch or fidget. The priest didn't speak to you, not directly. His words flowed upward, toward the vaulted ceiling, toward God. But not toward you. His sermons were for the nobility. His prayers were for the health of the lords, the grace of the ladies, the future of the realm. Your name was not in his mouth. Only your labor was in his interest. Still, you prayed, because what else could you do? You prayed for strength, for fewer beatings, for a whole loaf of bread instead of a crust, for warmth at night, for dry shoes, for one day where no one shouted your name in anger. And sometimes, for things you couldn't say aloud. That the steward would trip and break his leg, that the baroness would choke on her goose, that the knight who leered at the kitchen girls might fall on his sword during the hunt. You weren't alone in that. Everyone prayed, even those who claimed not to. The youngest boys lit candles when no one was watching. The older women muttered charms under their breath while scrubbing blood from linens. The stable hands nailed small crosses into the wood of the stalls, more for luck than belief, because in the castle there were two kinds of religion, the one preached by the priest and the one lived by the broken. You saw strange things, symbols etched into the stones beneath the floorboards, dolls made of twine tucked behind the wine casks, offerings, berries, feathers, smooth stones, left in hidden corners. No one spoke of them, but everyone knew. Because when you're desperate, when you live on the edge of survival, faith becomes a language of survival too. Not a creed, a cry. And yet, the official faith was used like a hammer. Confession was mandatory, even for sins you didn't understand. You were asked to admit to pride, envy, sloth, things that felt more like breath than choice. The priest asked if you'd lied, if you'd stolen, if you'd doubted, and you always said yes, even if you hadn't, because saying no was riskier. There were punishments, not always physical. Sometimes you were denied supper, or made to sleep outside, or forced to copy prayers until your fingers cramped. One girl was accused of speaking to the devil because she hummed an old song from her village. They shaved her head, locked her in the tower for a week. When she came back, she didn't speak at all. Her silence said more than any sermon. The nobles used religion like a mirror, admiring themselves through the veil of sanctity. They wore crosses inlaid with jewels. They held fasts, then broke them with private feasts. They sponsored relics, hung tapestries of saints, funded pilgrimages, all while punishing you for falling asleep during evening prayers. Their piety was performative. Yours was desperate. You once overheard the priest blessing a noble's sword before a campaign. "May it strike true in the name of the Lord," he said. You later saw that sword cleave through a servant during a drunken sparring match. The noble laughed. The priest said nothing. And still, you crossed yourself every morning. Because it wasn't about belief anymore, it was about protection. A ritual, like tying your boots, like checking the pot for rats, like flinching when someone raised their hand too fast. Faith had become armor. But even armor cracks. There were days, long, bitter days, when you stopped praying, when the bread was too moldy, when your fingers bled from scrubbing the same stone, when another servant vanished and no one spoke their name. You stopped folding your hands. You stopped bowing your head, not in defiance, in exhaustion, and you waited for lightning, for punishment, for wrath. But nothing happened. The world went on, and that was almost worse, because then you began to question not just the castle, but the silence behind the chapel doors, the absence, the emptiness. You wondered if God had ever lived there at all, or if the stones had swallowed him like they swallowed everything else. Still, you kept lighting candles, even when you stopped expecting answers, because hope, fragile, flickering, is a kind of rebellion too. And deep down, beneath the layers of soot and obedience, you still carried a spark, a belief that maybe one day justice would come. Not from the lords, not from the priest, but from somewhere older, wilder, from the part of you that had survived every blow, every insult, every silence. And if not justice, then memory. Because memory, too, is sacred. When danger came to the castle, it didn't knock, it crept. It arrived on silent hooves in the dark, or with smoke curling over the hills, or with rumors whispered from traveler to traveler until even the stones seemed to flinch. You always knew something was coming, not because anyone told you, but because the nobles grew restless. Voices rose, doors slammed, armor was polished, horses were readied, and the servants, we were told to stay calm, which meant panic was just behind the door. In theory, the castle was a fortress. Its walls were thick, its gates reinforced, its towers positioned for defense. But to you, it wasn't protection, it was a trap. When the gates closed, you didn't feel safe. You felt contained. Because in a siege, the nobles had stockpiles: wine, salted meat, dried fruits, fine bread sealed in barrels. You had whatever was left, which usually meant gruel, and whatever you could scavenge before the rats found it first. And when the siege lasted longer than expected, you didn't just starve, you rotted. The air grew heavy with smoke, with fear, with waste. Water had to be rationed. Fires were forbidden for fear of smoke drawing attention. You worked in silence, blind in the dark, your body shrinking day by day. You stopped thinking about escape. There was nowhere to go. During one siege, a servant girl named Alis began baking stale grain into hard biscuits and hiding them behind loose stones. She shared them with 4 others. It kept them alive for 2 extra days. When she was caught, they called it theft. She was whipped in front of the kitchen staff. The lord's wife didn't flinch. The steward didn't blink. Alis didn't cry, because crying used water. The worst wasn't hunger, it was the sickness. 1 cough became 10. The chamber grew thick with rot. There was no medicine, at least not for you. The priest gave last rites faster than he gave blessings. Corpses had to be moved at night to avoid frightening the children, though everyone knew what the linen bundles were. Eventually, even those rituals stopped. The bodies just stayed where they fell. And yet, the nobles still dined. Not as lavishly, no, but they kept their fire, their plates, their goblets. They told stories to distract themselves. They drank to stay warm. Meanwhile, you huddled with others in corners of the servants' wing, pressing together not for love, but for warmth. Sometimes it was hard to tell the difference, but war wasn't always a siege. Sometimes it came in the form of a single rider, a messenger bearing bad news, a fallen relative, a rebellion nearby, a noble calling and a debt. Suddenly, the castle was no longer a home, but a prize to be defended. Swords clashed, shouts rang out. And you didn't fight with weapons. You fought with your body, barricading doors, hauling buckets of boiling water, smuggling the injured down the servants' stairwells when the main halls ran red. You learned to tell real danger from drills. The footsteps were different. The tone in the steward's voice changed. You could hear the difference between a noble yelling out of frustration and one yelling because they knew they might die. That difference mattered. It was the difference between hiding in the pantry and being dragged into the fight. One winter, raiders breached the outer walls. You had no warning, just a scream. Raw, immediate, full of something ancient. A boy near the stable lost his hand trying to protect the dogs. A maid was found with her head split open by the chapel doors. The nobles fled to the keep. You weren't invited. You locked yourself in the laundry room with 3 others. No food, no light, just silence. You waited for hours, listening, boots thudding, metal scraping stone. Then nothing. When you emerged, the walls were blackened. Blood on the flagstones, and the nobles? Safe. Shaken, but safe. They didn't ask about the dead servants. They didn't check the lower quarters. They simply ordered the floors cleaned and the chapel re-blessed. You never forgot. The castle wanted to pretend, always, that order could be restored with enough polish and prayer, but war left stains that didn't scrub out. Not from the stone, not from your hands. Even when it didn't reach your gates, war was a shadow that touched everything. Taxes were raised to fund campaigns. Young men were taken as conscripts. Food became scarce as fields were seized. Sometimes, nobles would entertain visiting lords to form alliances. That meant banquets, which meant extra work. You fed men who might soon burn your village. You bowed to those who joked about raiding your homeland. You kept their goblets full while they argued over who owned the river that watered your family's field. And still, you endured. Because what choice did you have? There was no weapon in your hands, only a broom, a bucket, a memory of those who'd come before you and survived worse. You told yourself that if the walls held, you would too, that if the castle endured, so would you. But the truth was harder. The castle used you to endure. When the danger passed, they didn't thank you. They used your silence as proof of your loyalty, your labor as proof of your duty. And when the next threat came, and it always came, you were expected to do it all again, to carry, to clean, to serve. But every time, something changed. You grew quieter, sharper. You memorized the escape routes. You learned how to listen, how to slip between the cracks. And one day, as you stood in the courtyard watching the nobles rehang their banners, you realized you were no longer afraid. Because danger wasn't outside the walls. It never had been. It was inside, and you had survived it. Not because of the castle's protection, but despite it.